All right, this is Melissa Ryan joining you from my office. And before we get started and before I have my guests introduce themselves, I just want to let you know that if you continue to watch, what you're going to learn is what are some of the myths around grief. And we're going to debunk those. And then also, what are some of the signs that you might be dealing with grief, and then what you might do about that to get that support, because it is a topic that is often taboo in our culture, and a lot of us aren't really given the tools for A, how to recognize it, and B, to work through it. So my experts today, Stephanie and Lauren, are going to talk more about what they do, and then we'll dive into the topic. So thank you, ladies, for joining.
Thanks, Melissa, for having us here today. My name is Stephanie Weeden, and here with Lauren, we have a private practice in Golden, Colorado, named Rooted Counseling, where we specialize in grief therapy. Mm-hmm. We both are very passionate about this work because of our personal experiences, and also through different trainings and work experiences that we've had, where we've found that grief is often misplaced or displaced or not talked about. And so because of our own passion, we're really excited to do this talk today and put more information out there.
Cool.
Yeah. So I think many people have heard about the 5 stages of grief, right? And we think that grief is this linear process of you go from step 1 to step 2, and then you keep progressing 3, 4, 5, and then you're done grieving, and voila.
And you could probably get it done in a couple weeks.
Yeah, and then sweet, you're done, you're good to go, everything's fine. But what we'd like to let people know and remind people that maybe do know and have forgotten, or it's easy to get caught up in what we expect grief to look like, is that initial research, although well done and very valuable to the field, was really about patients who were told and knew they were dying of a terminal illness. It was about their grief process with knowing that they were not in a healthy place and that their life would be ending. And so that research specifically studied that population, not necessarily other people that experience grief outside of that narrow window, of which there are, how many different types of grief? Like 25 or more different types of grief. And a lot of the grief that people experience is not just related to terminal illnesses. And I know we looked up that list one time, but the list, there's disenfranchised grief, there's grief that involves like physical aspects that have changed, or grief even like in getting married, where yes, it's an exciting thing in life, but you're losing your singlehood, you're grieving the past as you knew it, and there's a big change. And so grief, some things I like to say is those 5 stages, although important and valuable, we might experience some of those things, they don't happen in order, and grief is definitely not linear. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
Just that model Lauren is talking about was developed in the 70s and is a preparation for dying versus the process that happens after death, or in these other like secondary losses that happen related to a lot of different things. We have basically any change that happens may come with some kind of loss, which has a grief process. And some grief obviously is much greater experience than some more of those smaller changes might be.
Mm-hmm. And would you say, like, one of the topics you mentioned, Lauren, was disenfranchised grief, that some of those smaller changes sometimes have their own unique aspects to it because the greater culture might not identify it as grief, especially around like events or situations that people expect you to be happy about.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's like this is the most wonderful time of the year, the holidays, or getting married, or having a baby, or all these things that on the outside you might think, I should feel this way, I should be happy, I should be excited. And yet those very things are often multi-layered and can have a variety of emotions. But especially also speaking to the disenfranchised grief, there's so much that our culture doesn't do a good job of acknowledging or even giving us permission, or we can feel sad for 3 days and then you better get back to work and be fine and start smiling again. And that's just not the way it goes. Not the way it goes. And I think that's something Stephanie and I both feel so strongly about, is helping clients have space to process grief as their process takes them. And I'm just thinking of some phrases that have been really powerful for me, is that grief will last much longer than you ever want it to. And it's like getting on this train. You can't get off just whenever you want. Like, it will run its course, and it's often longer than we want. Not to say that it's going to be a horrible journey the whole time, but it's not something that can be rushed through or followed in a formulaic way. And I know, can you talk about the grief waves? I love how you describe that. It's another way to think about it.
So the concept of grief waves are ideas of what we are often use the term triggers. So different things that happen that we anticipate or may not be anticipating that cause an increased feeling of grief symptoms. And so we might be feeling like, okay, I'm doing better. Like, we'll use death loss as the example for grief in this scenario. But like, there's been time has passed since the death, you're feeling better, life is getting more back to normal. And then something will happen that causes you to feel like you're starting over, that the grief has just like re-engaged at the hardest point, and you're thinking, oh my God, I thought I've already done this. Why am I back at this stage? And those anticipated things can be things like birthdays, anniversaries, the anniversary of the death, various, things that you were anticipating to happen that are not going to be happening now or happening in a different way. And then there can be things that take you by surprise. You hear a song on the radio, you see a face that reminds you of your person that died, or of an event that happened with them, or a memory, and it just like floors you. And I think that with clients, this can be a really unexpected thing that happens, these waves. And so it's the idea that grief, the process isn't linear, but the experience isn't linear either. It's just this like up and down. And so learning to expect those things that are coming, like preparing yourself that on, my special person's, my deceased person's birthday, I'm likely going to have a hard day. And you might be surprised that you didn't in fact have a hard day, but that something you didn't know was coming turned out being a lot harder.
Like yelling at the postman before, like, I told this story once at a workshop where like this bag of chips fell on my head from my pantry, and it was just after this really intense week and a lot going on, and it was like not a big deal, and maybe in a normal day it would have been kind of funny or amusing, but like this literal bag of chips fell on my head, and it was just this sense of feeling so out of control that I couldn't even control this one thing, and it just put me way over the edge. But it was like a part of my own grief process with what was going on for me, and how sometimes clients show up in our offices or going through something where it's the smallest, seemingly smallest thing, but it can have someone just fly off the handle, but it's really so deeply connected to a sense of loss of control, missing someone or something that was so important to them, and it might just seem like, whoa, what's their deal? But really it's their experience and what they're going through. So it's like, I just have this visual of like, it was just a stupid chip bag, but it like represented so much more than that, and it just like undid me. And so I think that's something Stephanie and I, through some of our work and our training and learning, like that we want to be able to let clients know it's okay to be however they are in any given moment. That does not, there are not these certain layers and steps you have to follow in grief to be quote unquote okay or making progress. Like it really is a journey unto its own.
And so when part of what I'm hearing you say is you invite clients to practice some self-acceptance and owning where they're at in the moment and knowing that can shift. How does this show up in relationship? It's complicated, isn't it?
There are a lot of layers to that.
Well, I mean, just I think one thing that is good to remember for everybody is that even in a family or a marriage or a friendship, people, even if they've experienced a similar or the same loss, their grief process will not be the same. And so it can add this extra layer of tension or frustration of like, you're my close friend or you're my partner, you're supposed to get me and get this, but like you're not even on parallel rail tracks. So it can be extremely frustrating and add to that loneliness and that isolation even more, because it is your own experience and someone can't exactly get it even if they know the person that died or experienced that same loss that you might have.
Yeah, one of the things I hear the most from clients and have had experience in my own life is that relationships are impacted more than anything else when it comes to the grief experience because of what Lauren's saying, either your partner or your friend or people in your community just don't get what your experience is, or their experience is different. Because like thinking of grief, the timeline of grief, there isn't a timeline. And our culture very much stigmatizes this idea that grief should be short-lived. We really shouldn't even have it, and we don't know how to talk about it. And so when we are grieving something, like if we're sharing the same grief loss or the same loss, it's expected that we would both feel equal amounts of grief, equal amounts of sadness at the same time for the same things, and that is just not the case. And so a lot of relationships are really impacted. If you think about couples in a romantic relationship or in a marriage, this can be really difficult because it feels like a disconnect. And so you talked about like leaving space, and kind of the idea of grief is giving permission for yourself to go through your own process, and also for your partner or your friend or whoever the person is to have their own process too. And that's difficult because we want to feel normal. We want to feel validated. And when somebody is grieving differently than us, that can feel really isolating.
And would you say too that not only can it feel isolating, but I have seen with my couples, there's this fear that it's leading to more disconnection in their relationship, that they're worried. Energetically, grief can take a lot. Like you can feel very fatigued. And so they're like, well, it feels like a lot of energy to even try to understand that my partner has a different grieving process, right? Because energetically that I'm like, it's requiring me to like hold that space, and maybe that's really hard. So your guys are shaking your head. You've seen some of this.
Well, just even the sense of, it's exhausting, and that exhaustion phase, we often feel like we're just in survival mode. And so you're just trying to get through your day, much less try to hold someone else up with their day, especially if it's someone that you care about. And I think like a lot in pictures or images. So another image that sticks out to me is like if there's a couple or a partnership that, or even like a close friend, it doesn't really matter what the relationship is, but if grief, quote unquote, gave me a broken leg, and so I'm kind of hurt, right? And I'm like leaning on my partner, my friend, my person. But if they're also grieving, they have a broken leg, and so we're kind of trying to like lean on each other.
It's very hobbly.
Not being very stable, and it's no one's fault. It's not, I'm not good enough, you're not good enough. It's just kind of the way it is and how grief works. And so it can cause more ripple effects of difficulties in the relationship, which is why we need more people, need more support, whether that's counseling or different types of self-care or mentors or friends or whatever. But it can't just be a Lone Star thing or just someone that you rely on just one other person, because it has to be bigger than that because it can be so exhausting and so crippling.
Right. I think another element that comes up a lot is that the grief process is already its own process, but there's this idea that because as a culture we're typically not educated about grief, and so we don't know how to support each other because we don't even know how to talk about grief. It just doesn't even make sense in some ways. And so often there's this idea of you are in this survival mode, just trying to take care of yourself, but also now you have to educate the people in your support system about what grief is or what your process is, and people typically don't know how to hold that space or be gentle with grief because it's uncomfortable. Most of us are uncomfortable when somebody's crying, when we don't know how to help, when we don't know what to do, and grief is very much a thing that can't be fixed. There's no solution to it. And so there's a lot of space of just like, I'm there for you, let me know what you need. And the person that's grieving is like, I have no idea what I need, or in this moment I need this, but in the next moment I don't need that, and it gets really confusing. And so that can cause this rift in support relationships as well, where the supporter then, it becomes about them. They feel bad. They feel like they're not a good friend, so then they take a step back. I don't know how to help you, so I'm not going to show up for you. And then then there's these secondary losses now inside of that grief process. So it's very complicated.
It's very complicated. So because of that, what are some signs that somebody might be grieving? Like, especially because what I'm hearing you saying is, yes, because it's not a topic we know how to talk about, a lot of folks might not even know how to recognize that they're even experiencing grief. So what would be some signs, some clues? Like you gave the example of this potato chip, and you may not have known you were grieving, but that's a sign of like, oh, my reaction is way stronger than I would have expected it to be. What are some other clues?
I mean, I think the most common way that we can describe grief is the idea of that there's very similar symptomology to depression or anxiety. So if you know that you've experienced a loss and you are feeling things that you might consider to be depression, it's likely related to grief. And one can lead to the other, and it can be confusing if you were already experiencing depression and now you have a loss. So there's a lot of crossover, but I think overall when we're thinking about symptomology, it's that, the sense of sadness, lack of motivation, exhaustion, fogginess.
I would say just difficulty making decisions, trouble thinking clearly, communication difficulties. I mean, just all those various aspects can show up, and that one person's grief will look different, but that there can be things in common that are happening.
Said something about the
okay?
sound. Rika's like, I can't hear you all,
hi,
but you
Rika.
look happy. So thanks, Rika, for the feedback. So go ahead, continue.
It's okay. I think I lost my thought.
You were talking about some of the symptomology and signs.
Yep. And that it's so understandable to grieve. It doesn't mean something's wrong with you or you're broken or it's irreparable. It's actually a very human, natural response to pain, to change, to loss, to something that happened that you didn't anticipate happening.
And I think that it's important to note that grief has to be experienced. And we tend to tuck it away, hide it away, run away from it, because culturally that's what's expected of us. But also we sometimes just don't know what to do with all of those feelings. And so it's like the idea of sweeping it under the rug. And with grief, or any kind of hard scenario that we live through, it will always resurface, and typically in a time that you don't want it to. We were joking earlier about, when you find yourself crying in the grocery store because you saw, something that reminded you of something out of the blue, and then all of a sudden you're weeping and you can't even finish your grocery shopping. And then you're like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? But it's this idea that those feelings are so intense that the body physically cannot hold them for a lifetime. And so they will come out. And grief is often combined with shock or trauma. And so then you have additional things.
Stuff that gets stored in the body,
Yes.
right? And so like I was sharing with you guys, I know that I'm very much a kinetic processor, that like through movement, I work through emotions. And so I have found it to be helpful to be checking in and regularly engaging in movement, because if I've, for whatever reason, put off something and I am in particular doing mountain biking and grief takes over, it's usually not very helpful to be like in this place of sadness and surrender when I'm supposed to be charging down a mountain. I found that very dangerous, actually. And so a few times, like I told you that one time, I was on this very long mountain bike ride, and you're committed, you can't go back, you're like downhill, uphill, and it's 30 miles in or whatever, and I just got to keep going, and I got injured, and now I'm sad and I'm bleeding, and it's just a big mess. And so particularly after that last incident, I'm like, I need to check in more and work through things prior to getting on the bike.
I think that's such a great story because it brings such truth to what happens with grief. But talking about checking in with your body, that's probably the primary starting step that we use working with clients is body awareness. And sometimes when we can't pinpoint our emotions or put words to our emotions, we can notice in our body, I've had more headaches or more stomach aches or lack of sleep, different changes that we feel in our body. And so sometimes those are easier to notice than our own feelings. And so creating the connection between the two is a huge starting step with grief work.
And so that answers what was going to be my next question, which is, you're not going to, if somebody knows they've been holding all this stuff, you're not going to just have them open the floodgates. That there's going to be a process where they're checking in with their body, you're checking in with them emotionally. You're shaking your guys' head.
I'm thinking of it in what we were talking earlier about, the idea of the timeline, or that there isn't this expected, like, this, and this. Grief work in the therapy context fits into that no timeline idea, because basically every time that you come to a session, you might have had a different experience. And so it's sitting in the space with the grief and being the therapist being okay with the discomfort of the client, and that's a safe place. But the idea of, like, little bits at a time. You don't want to have the floodgate, because it's just too much for the body to handle, and it's just too much chaos. And so it's really important to do little bits at a time, and to do different processes at a time, to make sure things are getting worked through and brought out of the body.
Yeah, it's kind of like unpacking it bit by bit, and then there might be times where you want to dive in a little deeper and work through some more stuff. There might be times where you just can only dip a toe in, and that's all I can handle, and I'm done. And that's okay. I think we have to learn to regulate our own abilities in that way. But the thought too of I just lost what I was going to say. It was good, too.
That'll happen.
Always.
That brilliance, it will return. Oh, there it goes.
Got it. Thank you. But just that even in therapy, in life, with learning to live with grief, it doesn't mean that the pain will go away, but that we will learn to live with it. And that life can still be rich and fulfilling and good, even with these things. It's not about getting through it and being over it, but learning to integrate these very deep, painful, hard, all these things, expletives you could say, of what grief can be and what it does to us, but still choosing how to figure out what it means for us to keep living forward. And that is a hard thing, and it's not something we just like a light switch, I'm done. It's this dance, kind of like back and forth. I did a little bit, I did it okay today, or I did not, and maybe I tried and then I didn't, or whatever. But that resonates with me, just the sense of, like, the pain won't leave, but we will learn to live with it, and we can be more amazing people because of what we've endured with our own grief.
It will become integrated in the story.
Absolutely.
It's not the whole story. It's not the plot of the story, but it might be a few chapters, and there could still be a storyline carrying through, moving forward.
But it's important to meet people wherever they are and not rush them along in the story, because those 2 or 3 chapters might be painfully long, or they might not be. I'm not saying that to sound like doom and gloom, but in the sense of, like, you can't rush through those chapters sometimes.
And the chapter might change, and then a couple chapters later, you're like, oh, here's another grief chapter. I didn't expect that, and that's really normal and really common, and should be expected.
Cool. Well, we're getting to a good wrap up time, so I would invite anyone that's watching this, if you identified some of those signs that Stephanie and Lauren shared about if you might be experiencing grief, please reach out to them. They are very passionate about what they do. They have a lot of great resources and just great understanding of what this can look like for people, and that it's this people experience it in unique ways. And I have referred clients to them because it requires such a special skill set to be able to hold that space and understand that each individual's process is their own process. So do you have any asks of the audience or last thoughts you want to share?
I just would say, whether or not it's something you're interested in for yourself, but just be on the lookout. Everyone knows someone who's grieving, and you don't have to be a perfect friend or a perfect partner, but we can all practice a little extra kindness when it comes to grief and loss.
Yeah, and there's so many resources, I think, as our culture is starting to accept that grief is more than we always thought it was, that there are a lot of resources, and we'd be happy to share them with anyone as well.
All right, so I will include their information in the comments, Rooted Counseling, and please feel free to reach out, and we are happy that you joined us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.